So to introduce our speaker today, we have our infamous, that's such a good term to use, Dave Harlan. Thank you, Dave.
You want this one? That's good. I was getting concerned and so I went looking for my notes. Time to hit them up here in front of me. But pretty excited about today that Scott Mauger is our speaker today, and Scott and his family moved to Hopewell from Pennsylvania, and they lived down around 2nd Street, and there was a lady there, Miss Mary Morris, who was an absolute lady and pretty much had so much to do with this community and what's going on. Her father was a Confederate colonel, and through her stories, and she lived, like I said, at the end of 2nd Street on the river there. Actually, there was an old cave that went back up under the house that we were forbidden to touch or go near. But she was so great to everybody, all of us that grew up in that neighborhood, and the Margers lived next door. And so out of that piqued Scott's interest, and he and Mark and his whole family are pretty much historians. He has quite a few credentials. He's been a member of the Richmond Civil War Roundtable for 30 years and served as president in '96. He's a member of the Titanic Historical Society for 32 years, the Confederate Literacy Society for 30 years, the Preservation for the Civil War Sites, now called the Civil War Trust. He's been in that for 30 years. This is the big one I had to practice on this. He's a noted necrolithologist. He can explain what that is. Specializing in Civil War personalities for over 40 years. He retired from Plant in 2007. He's been active in the community, and we really, really appreciate what he brings to the table. So, Scott, if you'd like to come up.
Can you hear me okay? A necrolithologist is nothing more than a guy who likes to visit every old graveyard that he can find. I believe I've been in every major graveyard in the United States over the years. I've managed to photograph the grave sites of all 426 Confederate general officers and almost 550 of the Union general officers. And they're buried from coast to coast. So it's been a great adventure for me. Okay. How about that? I'll try to be as loud as I can. Actually, I just got out of a 4-day sick bed. Something got me, and I was in bed all over the weekend, unfortunately. And I'm coming up on 70 years of age, and I swear I don't feel a day over 85. Now the phantom guns creep by. They are Pelham's guns. That quiet boy with the veteran mouth is Pelham. He is 22. He is to fight 60 battles and never lose a gun. Stephen Vincent Benet, 1928. In the summer of 1960, as a young boy of 8 years old, I had the great fortune of moving to the small town of Hopewell, about 25 miles southeast of Richmond. My home stood on the same ground along the Appomattox River as the huge Union Hospital that occupied that same site 95 years earlier. My first taste of the American Civil War was finding that summer many artifacts, spoons and cooking utensils, among other things, in the area. That Christmas, I received a copy of The Last Cavalier by Burke Davis, and from that point on, I became a devoted student of Civil War history. It was also my first introduction to a young Alabamian named John Pelham. Over the years, I have come to the conclusion that a great deal of the success enjoyed by the Confederate cavalry in the early months of the war excuse me. That wasn't part of the talk. Over the years, I've come to the conclusion that a great deal of the success enjoyed by the Confederate cavalry in the early months of the war was in no small part due to the efforts of this boy cannoneer. With all of the stern, bearded faces staring from the pages of the subsequent books that I devoured on the subject, this baby-faced young fellow named Pelham seemed so out of place. He only served a brief 21 months in the Confederate States Army, but the mark he left is still being pondered and studied as students and historians of the conflict continue to be amazed at his military prowess. To find out more about this extraordinary young fellow, one must travel to the backwoods of northeastern Alabama and then Benton County, now Calhoun County, near the small settlement of Alexandria. It was here in a log home overlooking Cane Creek that the third son of Dr. Atkinson and Martha Mumford McGehee Pelham first saw the light of day on September 7, 1838. John had 5 brothers and 1 sister, and they were typical of the young folks of that era and area. The Pelhams hunted, fished, rode bulls barebacked, and seemed to be entirely devoid of any fear whatsoever. Young John, even at an early age, had a reputation for his extraordinary skills and courage. The boys helped their father on his small plantation that he worked to supplement his minimal income as a country doctor. Every fall, John and his brothers would accompany the cotton crop to Wetumpka by flatboat, a 100-mile journey south at the junction of the Coosa and Tallapoosa rivers. He was raised a devoted Presbyterian and could be seen at church every Sunday in nearby Jacksonville with his entire family. This devotion to the Word of God was repeatedly remarked upon by his tent mate, John Eston Cook, and his General J.B. Stewart. In the spring of 1856, Atkinson Pelham's brother-in-law, Judge Thomas Walker, told the good doctor that the Honorable J.W. Harris, congressman from the Talladega district, intended to appoint one of the Pelham boys to the military academy at West Point. For reasons today unknown, Dr. Pelham chose his son John for this appointment. He arrived at the academy where he would spend the next 5 years of his life on June 1st, 1856. His roommate at the point was future Confederate Major General Thomas Lafayette Rawson, a virtual who's who of Civil War notables on both sides were either members of young Pelham's class or in the Corps of Cadets during the years that he spent there. When the author Charles G. Millam was doing research for his biography of Pelham entitled Gallant Pelham, American Extraordinary, he had the unique opportunity to interview General Adelbert Ames at his home in Massachusetts in the summer of 1932, less than a year before his death at the age of 97. Ames said of Pelham, and I quote, "He was easily the most popular man of the Corps in my time. Everybody liked him. I never heard anyone say a word against him. He was that kind of man whom you felt instinctively, here is a friend. Not that he was the sort to put himself forward to claim attention. No, he was quiet, simple, unassuming, and unpretentious. There was a reserve about him that we got to know covered an inner strength. I came to know him better than the other boys from the South because in the 3rd or 4th class, I've forgotten which, when quarters were being reassigned to make ready for the incoming class, he lived in my room for about 2 weeks. I got close to Pelham, you see, and I knew the man. There was something about him that drew you to him. I suppose nowadays it would be called personality." John Pelham had a tough go of it scholastically at the academy. He never ranked higher than 19th in any of his courses, that high ranking being in cavalry tactics. He accumulated well over 500 demerits, but this was not far from the average for the class. Cadet Pelham returned home twice on furlough during his years at the point, the summers of 1858 and 1860. And he seemed, by all accounts, he seemed to enjoy himself very much. In the spring of 1860, discussions among the cadets, both Northern and Southern, became commonplace on such topics as secession, states' rights, slavery, and the possibility of war. None of John Pelham's Northern friends ever heard him say anything negative concerning the North. He fervently believed, however, that one's allegiance was to his state. When South Carolina and then Mississippi seceded in late December 1860 and early January of 1861, it finally became clear that war clouds were gathering fast. Writing letters to Governor Moore, his father, and his sponsor, Judge Walker, young Pelham sought advice as to what course he should take. He also let it be known that he fondly hoped to graduate. 4.5 years of hard work was difficult to give up, but he was certain that if Alabama left the Union, it was the only honorable course that he could take. The first few months of 1861 must have been very hard for John, but he listened to his father's advice to wait. On February 27th, Pelham and Rosser sent almost identical letters to the newly elected President of the Confederate States, Jefferson Davis, seeking his guidance and asking if their services were needed at that time. In a March 7th letter to Dr. Pelham, his son wrote, "You need not be afraid of piquing my Southern feelings by respecting the Stars and Stripes. Although I am a most ultra-secessionist, I am still proud of the American flag. It does not belong to the North any more than to us, and has never had anything to do with our wrongs. I think both sides ought, in justice to the illustrious dead, lay it aside as a memento of our past greatness and our revolutionary renown. I would fight harder and longer to tear the Stars and Stripes from every Northern battlement than for any other cause. They have no right to use it, and we should not permit them to. It should be stored away with our other household goods, preserved spotless and unstained, not a single stripe erased or polluted, and not a single stripe obscured." After a letter from Dr. Pelham to President Davis concerning John's future, a commission as First Lieutenant of Artillery was issued to John Pelham dated March 16, 1861, and signed by then Secretary of War Leroy Polk Walker. It is not known if Pelham knew of his commission before he resigned from the Corps on April 22nd, but before his and Rosser's resignation reached Superintendent Richard Delafield's office, they were gone. On May 6, just 2 weeks later, the first class of 1861 was graduated. Pelham and Rosser at that time were approaching the Pelham home in Alexandria. The trip south was by a more westerly route, by way of Kentucky, where they crossed the Ohio River at Jeffersonville. And once at Louisville, the pair found traveling much safer, and they arrived to a hero's welcome. John immediately began, after a brief rest, to drill some of the homeboys in the county seat at Jacksonville. He was extremely frustrated, as the men seemed to do as they pleased. "They even chew tobacco in the ranks," he complained to his father. On May 10th, John Pelham and Tom Rosser traveled to Montgomery. Looking for a switch from artillery to cavalry, using the influences of Judge Walker, they were unable to persuade Secretary of War Walker, so Pelham accepted his commission as First Lieutenant of Artillery, that having been issued to him 2 months previously. Leaving Montgomery around the 15th, Rosser set off for North Carolina, while Lieutenant John Pelham headed north for his assignment as an ordnance officer at Lynchburg, Virginia. His duties there were to gather from all points the arms and ammunition critically needed for the successful defense of the Southland. He was in Lynchburg such a short time that he hardly got accustomed to his duties there. Up in Northern Virginia, 2 armies, the Army of the Shenandoah under Joe Johnston and the Army of the Potomac under P.G.T. Beauregard, were gathering at Harper's Ferry and Manassas, respectively. At this early junction, these 2 Southern armies were badly in need of instructors and drill masters. Young Lieutenant Pelham soon found his way under orders to proceed to Harper's Ferry and help drill the Wise Battery of Martinsburg. This battery is usually referred to as Albertus Battery, Albertus Wise Battery, and sometimes as Brown's Wise Battery. Pelham arrived at Harper's Ferry on June 15th, right in the middle of the evacuation of that place, and didn't meet up with his new command until a few miles from Charlestown. Now, a battery, if you don't know what it is, it's usually a section of 4 guns, and the men, to service those pieces. The battery's present commander, Captain Ephraim Albertus, was a bit taken back when approached by Pelham, but being an older fellow and not in good health, he turned the battery over to Pelham's complete charge. One man who was there that day later claimed, "He took us over then and there, and we knew he was boss before we went to sleep that night." Over the next month, Pelham worked his 60 men hard, 7 days a week, teaching and showing by example the fundamental rudiments of working and servicing a field piece. He taught them how to limber up, move the various equipages, the caissons, the forage wagons, and the like until the men could perform these functions in their sleep. He didn't just sit his horse and bark out orders either. John Pelham, you see, was a hands-on kind of guy, and he never asked any of his men what he wouldn't do himself. He was roundly cursed at some points for his iron discipline, but the men soon came to realize that he was doing it for their own good. Many men later claimed that what Pelham taught them early on probably saved their lives in many instances, and they soon began to take great pride in their abilities as cannoneers. A certain few young ladies from the Martinsburg area paid particular interest in the young lieutenant, most notably Belle Boyd and the Dandridge girls, Sally and Serena, from their nearby home on the Epequin Creek called the Bower. Things were beginning to heat up, however, and the days of intense training were finally going to pay off, or so thought the men and their young commander. On July 18th, they were given orders to march with the cavalry toward Manassas to hook up with Beauregard's army at that point. They had 60-odd miles to travel over some of the roughest terrain imaginable, but Pelham, looking out for both man and beast, got his men through with only a few hours' rest, just in time to play an important role in the upcoming battle. After waiting the better part of the day, on Sunday, July 21st, the Albertus and Rockbridge artilleries were finally ordered to the front. They arrived on Henry House Hill, and Pelham unlimbers and sends his first shot against the Yankee foe. One can almost see a smile on his face as he coolly stands among his 6-pounders, sending shot and shell toward the approaching infantry. He orders, "Limber up," and moves to a position further east along the hill, and there joins Latham's Lynchburg battery in a continuing rain of iron hail upon the assaults being sent forward by the Bluecoats. Finally, the Union men broke and began to flee from the battle lines in a perfect panic. The Albertus battery drew praise from General Stonewall Jackson, Joe Johnston, and Pierre Beauregard. It was quite clear that the artillery carried the day for the Southern forces at First Manassas. The young lieutenant from Alabama was beginning to make a name for himself. John Pelham learned from his experiences at First Manassas. He learned that well-drilled, well-disciplined men stand up to the test of working under fire. He also knew that if he kept his cool, the men would too. A gun crew must work in a vacuum, so to speak. Serving the peace while oblivious of the hailstorm swirling around them is probably the hardest thing a gun crew must endure. As I mentioned before, Pelham led by example and was very often seen jumping in with his men in any capacity needed at the time. He never asked of any of his men something he wouldn't do himself, and his crews loved him for it. In those hot and steamy months following the first battle of Bull Run, both sides sought to refit and in many cases reorganize their respective armies. The Albertus battery, under the watchful eye of young Pelham, continued their regimen of daily drilling and maneuvers. When the Army of the Potomac and the Army of the Shenandoah were merged, a total shakeup of the artillery was in order. The Albertus battery was consolidated with Grove's Culpeper battery, and his first unit formed the core of the soon-to-be 1st Stuart Horse Artillery Battalion. Although Pelham, still holding the rank of lieutenant, was outranked by both Captain Robert Franklin Beckham and Captain George Grove, he was appointed company commander with the approval of both Porter Alexander and William Nelson Pendleton. Back in the late summer, Joe Johnston had suggested that a brigade of cavalry be organized and that Colonel J.E.B. Stewart be the man to lead it. Stewart was promoted to brigadier general on September 24th and began immediately to form his new command. Always an admirer of the long arm, the artillery, Jeb wanted a battery of light artillery to complement his mounted force. Jeff Davis and Secretary of State Benjamin said no, and this is where the matter stood for the time being. In the beginning, Stewart preferred an acquaintance of his, Jim Breathitt, a young doctor, to head up this battery, and even had him transferred from the 1st Virginia Cav to Stewart's artillery, which at that time did not even exist. but in a short and simple order dated November 29, 1861, two of the most compatible military minds in history of warfare were joined together. Headquarters, Army of the Potomac. Captain Pelham will report with his battery to Brigadier General J.B. Stewart for service as horse artillery by command of General Johnston. Strange that this order to join two of the most audacious fighters in the war came from one who had a reputation of sometimes being unwilling to fight the enemy under any circumstances. At any rate, for the next 15 months or so, the two men would be closely associated on the field and in camp. And what John Pelham accomplished for his general in that time is almost impossible to believe. Did Pelham make a difference in the accomplishments of the Confederate horse artillery in 1862 and early 1863? You bet he did. With Pelham at the helm of the horse artillery, there was never any doubt on Stewart's part that Pelham would be in the right place at the right time and in the right way. There is nary a hint of censure because of failure concerning Pelham from Stewart, who would not hesitate to lambaste a subordinate if he thought the man warranted such treatment. So complete was Jeb's confidence in John Pelham that for the most part he gave Pelham free rein as far as his conduct on the field goes. And Stewart realized early on that his young cannoneer's genius for terrain and tactics was genuine. Read Stewart's reports and you get a feeling that Jeb had absolute faith in Pelham's abilities. They grew to love each other like brothers, and when it was all over, both had given all they had to the cause in which they so stridently believed. The winter months found Pelham going home to Alabama to recruit, and he was quite successful in gathering men from Talladega, Mobile, and some from down in New Orleans. The Napoleon detachment, made up of a few Italians, but mostly French, were known to burst into song while manning their pieces in the very face of the enemy. Centered that winter at Culpeper Courthouse, Pelham gradually built his command with both horses, men, and especially guns, some coming from General Stewart's kinsman, Governor John Lecture. They continued to drill in horsemanship and practice again and again any possible scenario that might present itself on the field. Pelham had his men ready for anything, for he knew anything might and probably would happen while under fire. With spring coming on the Yankee Army under George B. McClellan, he changed his base, abandoning his lines at Centerville and moving his entire army to Fortress Monroe for an attempt to take Richmond from that angle, coming up the peninsula formed by the York and James River. The Confederates moved down that way as well, and Pelham, with his 150 men and 8 guns, continued to drill in the vicinity of Yorktown, where General Prince John Magruder had masterfully held off the Union advance until reinforcements could arrive. On May 2nd, the horse artillery moved up closer to Williamsburg, some going over to the James River at Bigler's Wharf, and some going with Stewart along a string of redoubts which centered on Fort Magruder. The previous day, May 1st, Lieutenant Pelham received his promotion to captain, dated from March 23rd. General Stewart called for Pelham to come up to join him near Fort Magruder, where General Joe Hooker was taking a whipping from old Pete Longstreet. From the woods near the Telegraph Road, Pelham let loose a hellstorm of shot and shell that continued for over 3 hours and only ceased when his ammunition was depleted. In this baptism of fire with his new Blakely and the 2 12-pounders, they had served up a heaping helping of death and destruction to the tune of 360 shots, with Captain John Pelham shouting encouragement here and helping serve a gun there, and he was right in the thick of it with his men from start to finish. Stewart's report showed the pride he had in his gunners, and here it was that the beardless Alabamian was first dubbed the gallant Pelham. Pelham had moved over to the Yorktown Road during the afternoon, but it seemed to the Yanks and Hooker's division that the guns never seemed to stop, even while they were changing position. In Stewart's own words, before the order could be given, Pelham's battery was speaking to the enemy in thunder tones of defiance. Its maiden effort on the field thus fulfilling its function of unexpected arrival with instantaneous execution and sustaining in gallant style the fortunes of the day. During the night of May 5th, Johnston continued his retreat, and the cavalry and horse artillery moved to the west of town. About a mile past Burnt Ordinary, Pelham had a brief encounter with the men of the 3rd Pennsylvania and the 8th Illinois Cavalry under a certain Colonel William Averill, who 10 months hence would meet Captain Pelham again near a place called Kelly's Ford. Pelham's cannoneers stayed with the rear guard until finally reaching the environs of Richmond. While many men headed into the capital city with or without orders, the Stuart Horse Artillery was seen doing what they always were doing when not in action. They were honing their gunnery skills for the next encounter, and always under the watchful eye of their young commander. When Joe Johnston finally did offer a battle on May 31st at Seven Pines, it was at a heavy cost with little or nothing gained. The Stuart Horse Artillery saw no action here, being posted behind General Longstreet's men, who, it seems, never made it into the battle. Pelham here for the first time gazed upon a new face among the gray horsemen, a giant of a fellow at over 6 feet 4 and weighing better than 250 pounds. He was Johann August Heinrich Heroes von Bork of the Brandenburg Dragoons, a Prussian who embraced the cause with such fervor that he flew the battle flag of the Army of Northern Virginia from a turret on his estate in Germany until the day he died. He was to become one of Pelham's good friends in that summer and autumn of 1862. But you know, in all my research on John Pelham, I cannot find one person who was not his friend, and most were drawn to him as one is drawn to their own kinsman. He was handsome, he was young, he was fearless, he was bold, and at the same time he was the soul of modesty, truly shy and unassuming. He was about 5'10", blonde hair, blue eyes, you know. He'd be a model probably today if he was living. He complimented J.B. Stuart's own ideas of how cavalry and light mobile artillery should be utilized, and together they formed a team that has been immortalized in the annals of military history. When General Stuart embarked on his famous ride around McClellan, Captain John Pelham was not alone, as Lieutenant Jim Breathitt took command of the two-gun section. Was Pelham sick, on furlough, recruiting? No one can say for sure. There was a reorganization of the battery shortly thereafter, with some Marylanders being welcomed and a few men gaining well-earned promotions. With the cavalry and horse artillery at full strength, General Stuart received orders to proceed to the north of Richmond around Ashland on the 25th, and it was not known what the purpose of the move was until the following morning, when he learned that he was to guide Stonewall Jackson to his position, where he was to slam into General Fitz-John Porter's right flank. The horse artillery was used to clear the way for Jackson as he moved down toward Totopotomoy Creek. Pelham had his guns out front this time, as opposed to the grueling task of rear guarding he had done a month or so earlier further down the peninsula. As Jackson reached Polly Hunley's corner, the Battle of Mechanicsville opened, with A.P. Hill charging into Porter's Beaver Dam Creek line. For reasons unknown, Jackson did not engage and ordered his force to bivouac a short distance beyond the corner. As the cavalry was under his overall command at this time, they and the horse artillery settled down as well. On June 27th, Porter's Corps, who in some people's opinion was hung out to dry by McClellan, established a newer line just east of Powhite Creek near a local landmark called Gaines's Mill. The cavalry and Pelham, still assigned to protect Jackson's left flank, encountered the enemy near Old Church and gradually worked their way down to Old Cold Harbor, an important road junction and the site of a tavern. Jackson's men here at this time were having a rough go of it. The terrain was swampy and thick, and Yankee gunners under George Sykes had 12.5 cannon on a nearby hill that were talking the talk. Confederate artillery response was nil until a few guns from Jackson's artillery were brought up. Then Pelham, with his Blakely and Napoleon, moved out into an open field to encounter a new threat of 8 more guns being brought up from the Grapevine Bridge crossing of the Chickahominy. The Blakely was quickly knocked out of service, but the Napoleon continued to fire with such rapidity against the 8 newcomers that all who witnessed this uneven affair with the gunners and their captain working that solitary piece were truly amazed at their coolness amid the perfect lead storm directed at them. As the fire of the Federal pieces slackened, Pelham rode over to General Jackson and Stuart, who were nearby. With great pride and exuberance, Stuart introduced his young artillerist to General Jackson. Old Jack leaned over and heartily shook John Pelham's hand. At a loss of words and blushing like a child, Pelham hastened back to his gun. I, like many of you, enjoy standing on the same ground that our heroes did when performing these amazing feats and that we've read about through the years. This piece of ground is one of my favorite spots on the Gaines Mill battlefield division. And in my mind's eye, I can see Jim Breathen, Pelham, and the others working that piece for all they're worth. And sometimes I can even smell the powder if the wind's blowing right. But that's what makes history exciting for me. It's real. And it happened right here where I'm standing. It doesn't get any better than that. You can read about it all day long, but you can only get a feel for it by going there. The rest of the 7 days battles, the cavalry worked hard in their intelligence gathering mode. And on the 29th, they found the huge supply depot at White House on the Pamunkey River, a smoldering ruins. The home left to Colonel Rooney Lee, one of General Robert E. Lee's sons of the 9th Virginia Cavalry by his grandfather, had too been burnt to the ground. It was here that Stuart had a brief run-in with an ironclad Marblehead, still anchored offshore to guard the depot. The gunboat's captain even sent 2 boats ashore to drive off the cavalrymen, when Pelham began sending bursting shells out over the water, causing great dismay among the men in the open boats. Recalled, they quickly returned to the safety of their gunboat and began to steam away. But Captain Pelham wasn't through yet. He chased a Marblehead down the river by quickly limbering up and stopping only to send a shot or two and then continuing until a long arcing curve in the river soon took the gunboat out of range. Another feather in Pelham's cap. Attacking a Yankee gunboat from shore single-handedly was an audacious thing to attempt, but this was Pelham's style, up close and in your face. The Gray Horsemen were working in the vicinity of the river road when on the morning of July 3rd, Pelham with a single gun, supported by a squad of the 1st Virginia Cav, came across the entire Yankee army encamped at Harrison's Landing. Observing from the high ridge above Herring Creek called Evelynton, right down on Route 5, General Stuart arrived presently and ordered Pelham to open on the Yankee camp spread below him. For over a period of several hours, it was Pelham's single howitzer against the Army of the Potomac. Longstreet, who was supposedly on his way as support, became lost and wound up at Nance's shop. And in the meantime, the Federals got a battery into position and began to make Pelham's position on the heights untenable. So with his ammunition down to just a few rounds, he was compelled to retire. Now, General Stuart has been roundly criticized for his actions at Evelynton, but subsequent study of what Jeb knew at the time offers a clear picture of why Stuart acted as he did that morning. He had been officially notified that both Jackson and Longstreet were on their way with relief. And in staying his position for almost 5 hours, gave Longstreet, who was closest, more than enough time to travel the 5 miles or so to get to Evelyn. The cavalry and Pelham remained in that vicinity for the next week before moving north to Richmond near Atlee Station. The 7 days battles report from Brigadier General J.B. Stuart contained this interesting paragraph in that officially submitting it, he ran the great risk of losing the very officer and subordinate he was praising. Captain Pelham of the Horse Artillery displayed such signal ability as an artillerist, such heroic example and devotion in danger, and indomitable energy under difficulties in moving his battery, that reluctant as I am at the chance of losing such a valuable limb from the brigade, I feel bound to ask for his promotion, with the remark that in either cavalry or artillery, no field grade is too high for his merit and capacity. The officers and men of that battery emulated the example of their captain and did justice to the reputation already won. For the next month or so, things were fairly quiet with the Horse Artillery as they sought to refit and recruit while in their camps in southern Hanover County. A couple of new pieces came to Pelham during this time, and a good captain continued to drill his men and scour for supplies and equipage from Richmond and from the nearby neighborhoods. When the cavalry camps were moved to the immediate area of Hanover Courthouse on July 21st, Captain Pelham was introduced to the Price family, who owned Dundee. And there, the Price's daughters, Nanny and Elizabeth, made certain that young John Pelham and the other staff officers of General Stuart were made to feel welcome and relaxed when visiting. I first saw Dundee in 1986 when the house was but an empty shell and presumably doomed to suffer a slow death from neglect. In 1990, the home and property were purchased, and a gratifying success story has been completely restored, and today is a shining example of what can be done when the proper components come together. 2 reviews of the cavalry were held in July of 1862, and there would not be another for 11 months. Stewart was given a promotion to Major General on July 25th, and with it, command of the entire cavalry of the Army of Northern Virginia. Wade Hampton, Beverly Robertson, and Fitzhugh Lee all became brigadiers, and even Von Bork was handed a commission as major and a place on the staff. But no star came John Pelham's way, even though his responsibilities tripled with the reorganization of the cavalry. He now had command of Roger Preston Chew's battery and Hart's battery. Roger Preston Chew of VMI led Turner Ashby's long arm out in the valley and was destined to command the Stuart Horse Artillery in the last year of the war. James Franklin Hart of South Carolina was a gunner in the Hampton Legion. He was to give a leg for the cause before the fighting was over. Things were still fairly quiet until the first part of August. Took Fitzhugh Lee's men and Pelham on a reconnaissance toward Fredericksburg. They encountered some Yanks near Port Royal on the Rappahannock River. On the way back, they even captured a large force of the enemy on the Telegraph Road near Massaponax Church. This was the rear guard of a large raiding party headed for Hanover Junction. Stewart and Pelham made quick work of them along the Po River and forced the Federals to retreat back to their own lines. He got word at this time of a promotion to major, but it did not come through until late September, although it was dated August 16th. He would have to die before another promotion came his way. I do have a copy of his posthumously promotion to Lieutenant Colonel, but he had to die to get it. About a week after returning to camp at Hanover Courthouse, Pelham heard of the terrible scrap between Stonewall Jackson and Nathaniel Banks at Cedar Mountain. 4 days later, orders came to break camp and move toward Gordonsville and toward the Rapidan River line. Lee intended to punish that miscreant, John Pope, and Stewart, with his mounted armors, to play an important role in the drive to eradicate Pope's forces from the Virginia landscape. Pelham was, as was mentioned, with Fitzhugh Lee, who was ordered by Stewart to proceed directly to Raccoon Ford on the Rapidan River. Lee received this message near Davenport's Bridge on the North Anna River, very near Beaver Dam Station. A straight line from Davenport's to Raccoon was about 30 miles. Lee instead went by way of Louisa Courthouse to resupply and then proceeded north toward Verdiersville at the junction of the Orange Turnpike and the Orange Plank Road. On the night of the 17th, Stewart and some of his staff were almost captured by a raiding party of Yankee cavalry, and all the general's papers and maps were taken, not to mention his hat and cape. He blamed Fitzhugh Lee for this episode, but his orders never mentioned the need for speed, thus they felt no great urgency to join Stewart. This changed everything, as now Pope had Lee's intentions. So General Lee developed a new plan. Pelham crossed at Raccoon Ford and steadily drove John Buford's horsemen back toward the Rappahannock near a place called Kelly's Ford. This was when Pelham was at his best. A rapid dash forward, unlimber, a couple of quick shots, move here, move there. Keep up a steady stream of lead towards the enemy. Drive them back. He knew the best places, knew the distances, the most effective shot to use. He was the master of the situation, and he could see it and react to it instantaneously. He was quite simply born to it. It was a God-given talent that is rarely seen today. Pelham had it, and it flowed from him as naturally as if he was on a quiet evening stroll. Fighting between the respective cavalries erupted all along the upper fords of the Rappahannock as both sides struggled for control of these crossings. When Stewart departed on his raid up to Catlett Station on the Orange and Alexandria Railroad, Pelham was again left behind. This time Chew and 2 pieces went along. All this time he protected the Rappahannock line, here at Freeman's Ford, there at Welford's, and for a 27-hour stretch at Waterloo Bridge, he was ever vigilant. As Pope finally withdrew, the cavalry and horse artillery finally crossed upriver Henson's Mill and hooked up with General Jackson at Salem and headed together toward Pope's rear at Manassas Junction. Pelham was put in charge of the depot, and while sampling a few of the tasty wares from all of the suckler wagons teeming with goodies, Pelham had his eyes on but one thing: the Yankee Reserve artillery. For the next few days, Pelham was everywhere, and when Jackson attacked that bloody afternoon General Rufus King's division at the Bronner Farm, he felt the need for artillery on his right, for the Yanks had suddenly thrown into battery several guns which were now trained on Jackson. Out of the woods in the late afternoon came 2 guns and Major John Pelham, who unlimbered and began firing at a range of only 50 yards. He was well forward of the Confederate lines and seemed to face total annihilation, but Pelham would not leave. He stayed and forced the withdrawal of a Federal brigade. Jackson's report of the Battle of Groveton stated, "Owing to the difficulty of getting artillery through the woods, I did not have as much of that arm as I desired at the opening of the engagement. But this want was met by Major John Pelham with the Stuart Horse Artillery, who dashed forward on my right and opened upon the enemy at a moment when his services were much needed." As at Gaines's Mill, Jackson later personally thanked and congratulated Pelham for his bold actions that day. He, in fact, did great service during the entire battle and was actually told by General Jackson to act as the occasion might require. Given discretionary orders from Stonewall Jackson on the field is perhaps the highest honor that the young major ever received. The Battle of Second Manassas was hardly over when Pelham immediately began to repair the damage to his guns. Those that were serviceable were brought to bear as the Army continued to harass Pope at Centerville, Pleasant Valley, and Chantilly. The Federals finally retired into Washington, and Pope had been swept from Virginia. Pelham's star had shone brightly this past week, but the best was yet to come. On September 4th, the Army of Northern Virginia crossed the Potomac River for its first invasion of northern soil. The reasons were twofold: to bring Maryland in on the side of the Confederacy, and 2, to win a major battle in the North might very well bring recognition and perhaps assistance from England and France. Pelham crossed his batteries at White's Ford on the Potomac, and the horse artillery and cavalry hooked up at Poolesville. They, the cavalry brigades and guns, were spread out to cover the areas of occupation by the great troops. On the 8th, Stuart's headquarters at Urbana, just south of Frederick, arranged the famous Maryland Ball at the old academy there. And on that evening, General Stuart, his staff, and many of his fellow officers danced the night away until interrupted by some impertinent bluecoats. They were quickly driven off, and the ball resumed, a brief respite in the hellish reality of war. In the next few days, Pelham turned up missing for a whole night while the artillery was slowly and stubbornly retreating from their positions in Turner's Gap through South Mountain. He did return, however, and continued to delay the Yankee advance at Boonesboro, and General Lee could effect the concentration of his forces behind Antietam Creek. Stuart and the cavalry, along with Pelham, took position on the far left of the Confederate line on a high ridge called Nicodemus Heights. On the morning of September 17th, Hooker's division again began their forward movement toward a local landmark, a small Dunker church. But Miller's cornfield had to be first crossed, and it was on this hill that Jackson's artillery was given to Pelham. Such was old Jack's complete faith in the young major's ability. He had his own guns, plus pieces from the Rock Ridge, Danville, Allegheny, 2nd Maryland, Bedford, Richmond Hampton, and Louisiana Guard batteries. 19 guns in all, and a clear field of fire right down on Joe Hooker's head. He gave Hooker's men hell, and when Joe Mansfield's men came up in support, he blasted them as well. Like the master who could see all, Pelham then moved to his right, to another ridge behind the west woods called Hauser's. And here commenced a barrage of shot and shell that swept clear down to the church on the Hager's Downpike. He continued to move as the situation warranted, and he greatly aided the infantry's attempts to drive off the 2 divisions of William French and John Sedgwick. In attempting to silence a large mass of Union guns in the North Woods, Pelham was roughly treated and lost almost all of his teams, so that the men had to actually move the guns by hand. Pelham's hand in the fighting at Sharpsburg was pretty much over by 11 a.m. as the battle moved toward the center of the line. But it has been noted by historians that Pelham's move over to Hauser's Ridge was a masterstroke, As with Pelham's eye for terrain, he instantly recognized it as the key to the whole of Jackson's line. Jennings Cropper Wise, in his 1915 History of the Army of Northern Virginia Artillery, titled The Long Arm of Lee, states, and I quote, "No one movement on either side bore a greater influence on the final issue of the battle than did the advancement of Pelham's group during the interim between Hooker's and Mansfield's attack. This was a move on the chessboard, though perhaps by a pawn, which baffled the most powerful pieces of the enemy. It was one of the master strokes by a subordinate, highly developed initiative, which has so often been found to play a major part in the tactical success of the superior." Pelham perhaps played such a role that day that he was in reality Stonewall Jackson's chief of artillery for the battle, and Jackson, better than anyone, appreciated and valued his contributions that morning. He was later heard to say, "With a Pelham on each flank, I believe I could whip the world." On the retreat, the horse artillery did an outstanding job at Boatler's Ford on the Potomac at Shepherdstown, and a few days later joined Stuart near Martinsburg. They soon pitched camp around Millwood, and another reorganization took place at this time. Jim Breathitt and Mathis Henry were both promoted to captain, and each was given a battery. Major Pelham now had 5 batteries under his command, 22 guns, and better than 600 men. Besides Jim Breathitt and Mathis Henry, James Hart, Marcellus Mormon, and Roger True were also given their own crews. In the latter days of September, the cavalry headquarters of the Army of Northern Virginia was at the Bower, a beautiful home of the Dandridge family on the Opequon Creek between Charlestown and Martinsburg in present-day West Virginia. It had to have been the best time of young John Pelham's life. It is said that he fell in love here with Sally Dandridge and became engaged to be married. For those of you here today who have had the fortune of seeing this old home firsthand, and I've walked its grounds, it's one of the most beautiful places I've ever seen. Just a great view to the mountains and bubbling creek down below. It's a beautiful place. Well, they had to run the Yankees away a few times during this period, but the main event occurred on the evening of October 9th, when General Stuart with some 1,800 of his best troopers embarked on the famous Chambersburg raid. The Stuart horse artillery carried 4 guns in front and 2 more in the rear guard. You follow that route today, and you will, as I did, simply shake your head and mutter, how did Pelham and his men get those guns through and keep up the grueling pace, especially those last 50 miles or so? And they did it in a matter of hours. He was there at the end, where he covered the cavalry crossing at White's Ford and kept up such a constant fire that allowed Matt Butler's command to close up and cross as well. 1,800 men, 1,200 horses, about 1,400 captured horses, and 60 artillerists across a river chest high and 400 yards wide, and they all made it across. Remarkable, even after the passage of so many years. One of the most incredible things I ever heard of. Stuart and Pelham, they were at the peak of their careers, and it seemed that Southern independence was near at hand. At the end of October, McClellan crossed Potomac for another foray into Virginia, and it was the cavalry's job to keep the enemy ignorant of the location of the 2 corps of Longstreet and Jackson. Called the 10 Days' Battles by cavalry historians, Stuart and Pelham fought an almost non-stop running battle against Alfred Pleasonton and William Averell from Mountsville on October 31st to Amosville on November 10th, with lots of action in between, including Pelham getting down from his horse and personally sighting a gun on Venus Hill near Wellburn that struck down the color bearer of the 7th Indiana at a distance of over 800 yards. And the bulldog tenacity of Pelham's fight at Barbie's Crossroads, where he was forced to fight both front and rear just to save his guns. But surrender a gun of the Stuart horse artillery? Absolutely unheard of. He would have fought down to the last man, and his gunners knew it. Things quieted down in mid-November. McClellan had been replaced by Burnside on the 7th, and cavalry patrols reported that the Army of the Potomac was leaving the environs of Warrenton and marching down the north bank of the Rappahannock toward Fredericksburg. During the next 3 weeks, Pelham stayed below the town near Skinker's Neck to keep an eye on any Yankee gunboats that might be bold enough to ascend the river. D.H. Hill and Rooney Lee both mentioned Pelham in their reports as making it hot for several boats in the Port Royal area. About the 7th of December, Stewart ordered Pelham to move up to Camp No Camp, which was the name of Stewart's present camp there. Burnside was about to make his move. Pelham joined the cavalry at Hamilton's Crossing on the morning of December 13th. A message from General Stewart asked Pelham to move forward and assert the enemy's intentions. Running 2 pieces forward of Blakely and Napoleon, of Captain Mathis Henry's battery to the intersection of the Stage Road and the Mine Road, he lined up behind a row of cedars along the road and commenced firing with solid shot into the left flank of the Federal advance about 500 yards in his immediate front. He did very well at first, but then the Union artillery returned the compliment with such ferocious reply that, according to one who was there, in a few minutes a battery of 32-pounders, which were all the way across the river, opened fire on us. Then a light battery of 6 guns dashed to the infantry line and opened with shrapnel. We were literally smothered with shot and shell. We lost 11 of 12 horses and 19 of 14 men killed and wounded. Stewart sent von Bork out to recall Pelham, but the young major would not leave. Tell the general I can hold my ground. And for the next hour, he moved his gun from one position to another. One gun against a grand division of the Army of the Potomac. General Lee, who was at this time on Prospect Hill, exclaimed, "It is glorious to see such courage in one so young." And Jackson, who was also watching and quite familiar with the young man's courage, later asked of Stewart, "General Stewart, if you have another Pelham, I wish you would give him to me." He was known and loved by all who witnessed his actions on the fog-shrouded plain that cold December morning as Gallant Pelham, a name given to him by General Robert E. Lee. And Pelham was the only officer below the rank of colonel ever mentioned in any of Lee's reports, battle reports. About 2 weeks later, on Christmas Day, the cavalry embarked on the Dumfries raid, crossing the Rapidan at Ely's Ford and the Rappahannock at Kelly's Ford, and the Gray Horse spent the next week nipping and snapping at the Union forces and even managing to burn a few well-supplied and unoccupied camps of the enemy. Those very same fellows that were out looking for the raiders. Pelham continued to amaze by keeping up with all of his guns and even crossing the Occoquan at a most difficult and rocky crossing called Selectman's Ford. Go there today, and you, like I, will be asking yourself, how in the devil did he get his guns across here? But he did, and the men made it back on New Year's Day with minimal loss and much gained in intelligence, and leaving the Yankees' communications in disarray. Things were quiet on the Rappahannock line for the next few cold winter months. Days were spent in social calls at the various homes in the area, and even included a trip or two south to visit Dundee. It was also during this time that General Stewart again petitioned Adjutant General Samuel Cooper for promotion for his gallant chief of artillery, and in closing his letter he remarked, "No veteran his age has ever shown more coolness and better judgment in the sphere of his duty." In the early part of March 1863, he visited his brother Sam in the camp of the Alabama regiment to which he belonged. Also, Pelham received a gift of candy from Miss Annie Price of Dundee and a Miss Brill, with whom she was visiting over at Orange Courthouse. He decided to go over and thank the ladies in person, and thus set in motion a chain of events that would be fatal for John Pelham. He left early so as to outdistance any courier who might be sent out to recall him to camp. Indeed, Stewart did send out that courier, but receiving the recall order that came from Stewart on the train platform at Orange, he also received a note from Fitzhugh Lee explaining that a large body of Yankee cavalry under William Averill was seen at Morrisville heading for Kelly's Ford on the Rappahannock River. When Pelham arrived at Culpeper by train, he had to borrow a mount from Sam Sweeney, the banjo player. And in the early morning hours of St. Patrick's Day, for the 12 miles between Culpeper and the river. When he, Stewart, and Harry Gilmore arrived near the Wheatley farm, the skirmishers from both sides were already slinging lead. Pelham realized that Breathitt was not yet up with the guns, and what actually happened next is a mystery to this day. More than a half dozen men wrote of Pelham's mortal wounding at Kelly's Ford, who were not even there that day. Of the two who did leave eyewitness accounts, both contradict each other. At my rate, in my opinion, Pelham did indeed join a charge with the 3rd Virginia Cav and against the stone wall at the Wheatley Farm, which was still there up to about 10 years ago until they came in and bulldozed it. At any rate, as he was charging near the gap in the wall, he was sitting at the base of his head with a piece of shell about the size of your thumbnail, and it penetrated about an inch into the back of his head. And because the position of the Union artillery, it's my belief that it was a premature charge from one of his own guns that burst over his head and killed him. Because, like I said, we went there in the position where the Yankee artillery was, it was impossible for that to have happened. So, ironically, he was basically killed by his own artillery. Well, he was, like I said, he was struck by a bursting shell overhead. He was thrown over the back of a horse and led to the rear in search of an ambulance. The men who were entrusted to this duty, thought their charge to be already dead. So the 4 miles they covered must have taken hours. By the time he was examined near Elkwood and found to be alive, he was probably beyond all help. He was, with great haste, taken by ambulance to the Shackelford home in Culpeper, and he died there around 1 a.m. on March 18th without gaining consciousness. Joseph L. Mangini, the Company D, 12th Virginia Cav, was supposedly one of the men who carried Pelham from the field that day. Thus ended the life of another young and promising Southern soldier. But why was he any different from the thousands of young men on both sides who gave their all in this conflict? He was no doubt a romantic figure, his character and manners impeccable. I think we remember John Pelham for many reasons. Read General Stewart's telegram to Representative Curry of Alabama announcing Pelham's death, his general orders to the Cavalry Division dated March 20th, or the heartbreaking personal letter written to his father, Dr. Atkinson Pelham, dated March 29th. They say much more than I can how Pelham was viewed by his superiors, his fellow officers, and his grimy cannoneers, who would have followed him to hell and back if he had so ordered. General Stewart took immediate steps to see that his artillery troop was given national honor. He lay in state at Richmond and then was sent by train home to Alabama. He lies today buried in a small cemetery of Jacksonville, Alabama, under a beautiful monument erected to his honor in 1905. It has been vandalized over the years. The nose and the hat brim are broken off, and ironically, both the birth and the death dates are incorrect. But on the side of the monument is carved, "How shall we rank thee upon glory's page, then more than soldier?" I think we all know the answer to that. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.